Knowledge organization infrastructure is meant to combine the social and the technical and bring the artifacts of cultural production into a digital landscape where they can be governed according to Knowledge Commons governance principles. And so this is going to be a little bit technical, a little bit social, a little bit theoretical, a little bit practical. I hope you enjoy it.
All right, so we're talking about knowledge organization infrastructure, so it feels appropriate to start with knowledge. And where do we get knowledge? There's a body of theory and work out there, which is called cultural science, which says that the evolutionary purpose of culture is to make knowledge. And it does that by making groups. So culture makes groups, and groups make knowledge. Today we're focused on groups, how they produce knowledge, and then what it means to organize that through these technical systems. And so in cultural science, they call these groups Demes. And what they mean by that is a unit of cultural groupishness. So if I use that word when I'm talking, I just want to give you a quick definition that it is a group formed through shared knowledge, culture, and social learning. And what we're talking about today is essentially the creation of synthetic Demes, which is these structured digital representations of groups, of their collective knowledge, but also importantly, the practices and governance processes that they go into organizing that. So unlike external models or external representations of organizations, in what we're talking about, the group actively curates their own knowledge, manages, governs it. So you might be more familiar with the term digital twin, which is a model of an intended or actual real world. It could be a physical object. It could be something like a city, right? So you have a smart city, which is almost like a digital twin of the physical city, and that serves as this digital counterpart. And they can be deeply problematic for us because they are a means through which you can do preemptive interventions. For instance, you could say in this city that there's this area over here which we can predict that there's going to be more crime, so we're going to deploy police. The people who are providing the data that is going into that digital twin actually have no power over that. So it can be used for surveillance, it raises privacy concerns, there could be coercion that occurs. So in particular, we're talking about organizational digital twins today. And we just want to get across the notion that if we don't start making our own versions of these and governing them how we wish, Palantir is going to do it for us, right? So this is really what we're talking about today.
So we've been using this term KOI, K-O-I, for knowledge organization infrastructure, and that's because we've started building up technologies and practices together. I personally am a fan of a particular paper by Lucy Suchman on reconstructing technology as social practice, which informs at least how I engage with some of these ideas. But here we're reasoning about KOI as a practice for reclaiming organizational control over the digital representations of our knowledge and culture. We're also thinking of it as a way to operationalize that. So by making the connection to a digital twin and at the same time taking agency over it, or ensuring that the principle of that agent, if it is agentic, is the community itself, then we actually can have enhanced collective intelligence. And so on the one hand, we have a lot of problematization associated with digital twins of social or socio-technical or cyber-physical systems. We also have tons of opportunity as long as the people who are constructing and governing those things are the same people who are most immediately affected by them. And so knowledge organization infrastructure is the name for the project for which Ellie and I are co-PIs at Metagov. I'm the technical PI, she's the social PI. I have a distributed robotics background. Actually, Ellie, I know you do ethnography now. I actually don't know.
Political science and cultural studies. I'm an ethnographer.
Yeah, it's pretty relevant, right? So a way of conceptualizing KOI is by first looking at it as a pairing of a social and a technical view. The social view is coded on things like the experiences of interacting with it, the policies that are implemented within it, the ontologies that structure it. From a technical view, these look like interfaces, the things we actually touch and play with, talk to, read from, write to, the logic and rules. It's like the back end. It's the part that determines like what happens when you do something, and then there's the even further back end where you get to the databases or the integrations with other tools and the way data is shared between things. I wrote a long-form blog post a year or two ago that kind of kicked off some of this current inquiry, and it sort of simply viewed the organization as a kind of cybernetic thing to begin with. You got people, you got some interfaces, some data, some rules, some infrastructure, and the organization level actor is also able to sense and learn in addition to the individual level actors. So in order for this system to become not quite so dystopic, we were actually building on some other work around how knowledge objects are different from information. So knowledge objects are way less facty than information or data the way that we normally construe it. So I'm going to give a quick review of why this is technically different. So for starters, we're using objects as reference, which means that the things that we're talking about in KOI systems are usually references to other things. And that's important because we want to make sure that we can have conversations even when we're not sure we're talking about the same thing. And if we can't have conversations when we're not sure we're talking about the same thing, well, frankly, we probably can't have conversations about anything particularly interesting. But technically getting a system that supports that is tricky, and we'll come back to how we did it. The next element is that normally when you do data processing within an application, you have this very linear flow. You might have lots of different data sources, but you go through this process that's very linear of conforming it and organizing the facts and putting them somewhere that you can get them. They're serialized and they're all very true now, and we know they're true because they're in the database. But when we're dealing with knowledge, knowledge is very loopy. It's not something that we want to be quite so facty. We want to have room to take in facts or things that we accept as facts or data from elsewhere, but we also need to be able to take in other knowledge objects, and we need to be able to compose them, decompose them, decorate or enhance them, mutate them, curate, search through them, generate new ones. And this very loopy process requires a different kind of infrastructure, a different kind of ontology. So once we have these things, what do we do with them? Well, a digital twin or any of these models are things that have a kind of shape. And so here we put the model in the model view controller paradigm. It's a software development paradigm, software architecture and design paradigm. And you've got the user, and they act on something via a controller. It changes the model. The model is updated, and thus changes a view. The view is the thing that someone sees. If we zoom out enough and think about this as a governance pattern, we can put the digital twin in the role of the model, and we can look at the governance surface, the controller as a governance surface. It's how people decide how it's managed, what goes in it, what can't go in it, who can use what under what circumstances. That's your governance plane. And then the views are all of the tools or data products or services or enabling activities that are available to those users. And so you can get a simple closed value chain as long as a group of users exercise their governance authority to assemble and monitor and maintain a set of models with rules about who can use them and under what circumstances. This basically comes back to how organizations and infrastructures always relate. In order for an infrastructure to exist, someone had to build it, so it didn't come from nowhere. In this case, I might add provision in addition to use, operate, monitor, maintain, and govern. So organizations use, operate, monitor, maintain, and govern infrastructures. Infrastructures enable, facilitate, standardize, automate, and decentralize the activity of organizations. So it's actually quite important for us to think about infrastructures if we want to have more decentralized organizations or spread power out. In practice, when it comes to building up common knowledge or representations of common knowledge, this usually means that there's some enabling technologies or service providers, possibly some enabling organizations that facilitate the initiation of this thing. And then you'll have organizations or groups of people who are benefiting from it or are enabled by that infrastructure. And you might have other technologies that inherit from it, like in a case where these tools themselves provide endpoints or APIs that allow other tools to access them, assuming the governing people, organizations, allow them to do so. And finally, this model gives us a kind of real distributed coordination model where a bunch of people are doing their own things in their own environments. Some sort of sensory apparatus is picking those things up. They're being assembled into this collection of knowledge objects, and that collection of knowledge objects is then available to people doing things in the world, and the loop just runs. And what's really important about this is that it's actually the same creepy thing, so it comes back to actually the governance part. It's not really all that different, it's really about who gets to do it for you. And so really being intentional and understanding this is a prerequisite for engaging in a world where the relevant cultural representations are increasingly digital, and we can't get away from this. So we have to take ownership over it, or it'll be imposed upon us. Okay. All right, so I'll keep this short. It's a little bit of a technical review. So we have a concept called reference identifier. It's a special case of a URI. I think I'll push through this relatively quickly. There's an open source repo if you want to check them out. We use those RID as a specific kind of identifier that are talked about by COI nodes. The COI nodes can do 4 types of interactions. They can listen, they can make external calls, they can broadcast messages, and they can respond to queries. This basically means that they're equipped to interact sort of pseudo-socially with other COI nodes. They don't need to know a priori what they're going to be talking about because RIDs are very flexible, and they can interact in one-way communication or two-way communication, passive communication or active communication, and they have both input and output capabilities. And the I/O dimension there is emphasizing on the flow of the knowledge objects, not necessarily who initiated the exchange. This allows us to build networks, and these networks allow us to distribute these activities. And these different kinds of nodes within these COI nets can fulfill different functions. So they can harvest information from a source, assuming their permission to do so. They can coordinate the interaction with each other. They can process data into new data assets, new knowledge objects, and they can act on other systems, such as writing into a Slack space. All right, now it's Ellie.
So here's a couple of examples of how we're experimenting with this architecture that BlockScience initially has developed. So Metagov was the second COI. Firstly, BlockScience created one within their own quite decentralized company. And then, so Metagov is quite a different group of collaborators. We're all over the world. We meet primarily on these digital platforms. There's researchers, there's practitioners. The mission of Metagov, for those that don't know us, is to create a governance layer of the internet. But we have all of these knowledge objects and artifacts that are coming out through these interactions. And some of them are also occurring in really informal spaces like the Slack channels. Or in seminars where people are talking, or meetings where we're meeting on Zoom. So the work is quite emergent and evolving all the time, and it's actually really tricky for us because we're such a permissionless organization that people are coming in all the time and they're asking, what the hell is Metagov? How do I get involved? What is this thing? I have to say we haven't really resolved this, but this is what we're working towards with McCoy. So the idea is that we need ways for people to know Metagov more easily, or for instance to be able to figure out what role they might play in it, or to avoid situations where, say, the board is the same people forever and ever because they retain all the memory of the organization. So we've started creating this koi pond, and we're using this architecture that Zargham has described. So the things that are coming into Metagov's koi pond are things like our Substack, our Google Drive, Slack channels, papers, importantly, that the researchers have written, an Airtable called GovBase, which has loads of data on DAOs and things like that. And so we've created this ability for these objects to be seen within this koi pond, but then importantly also for integrations for other kind of technical means of then being able to work with those as a group. We can govern over them. We can say this knowledge set belongs to this project, these people are associated with it, etc. And then we can say plug it in. It doesn't have to be an LLM. It could be any kind of microservice that we want to create, such as a mentor matching kind of machine learning system or whatever it might be. In this case, what we've started with is actually just using the ChatGPT API to create what we've called Koi GPT, which it operates inside of our Slack channel. And what's useful is that you can call up this particular Koi GPT. There's a little example, a little conversation that Lee from Metagov over here, Ellie where Metagov over here is having with Koi GPT, asking it some questions. So and basically using the materials that are in this RAG system, but that have importantly been governed and curated by the community. Another one that I think is important here is another tool that we created as a tool for doing digital ethnography. So we created a bot which you can use, say, in Discord or Slack in this case. We're also in the process of trying to create one for Telegram. But the idea of this is if someone makes a post in an informal channel within your community and you think this is important, you can put this telescope emoji on it. We created this so that the bot would then send a message to the author of that comment and ask for their permission to include that comment in our qualitative data set. We've now realized, because we're trying to be ethical here, we've now realized that this is actually an extremely useful tool within Koi, because any member of that community can say, this is a super interesting comment that someone's made. I want to signal that this should be associated with a particular knowledge set or seen by these particular artificial intelligences that we might be bringing into our system. And now the stage we're at is we then bring these insights that people have written, we're bringing them into Obsidian vaults where the ethnographers are adding links and context to them and feeding them back to the Koi. So the ethnographer actually becomes the human in the loop of the artificial system, where you could then potentially create, say, an AI agent that is able to take in not just the knowledge and information, the data that we're kind of giving it, but also this context that humans are providing. It doesn't need to be a trained up ethnographer, it could be a community manager, other community members, etc. So this is just one way that we're trying to curate the knowledge and ensure that it corresponds to a community's own understanding of itself, particularly when we're starting to create agents or other artificial intelligences that we're working within, that we're using and working within these human-machine systems.
So this version of the diagram is a sort of almost fuller view of how these things come together. So we have plugins for Google Drive and GitHub. So those are knowledge objects that are then legible via RID systems. You can pull web links and incorporate them if you index them. You can connect to Slack. We're predominantly mediating Slack through the Telescope bot for the consent reasons that we've discussed. With regards to GitHub repos and Google Drives, it's usually by folder structure. There's also the permissions native to the things that we're connecting to, so we don't have to totally overload the system with new layers of permissions. There's a way I like to describe this sometimes is as duct tape and WD-40, because what we're not trying to do is build a new app. We're actually trying to let you stitch the shit that you have already together in a way that assembles a useful toolkit, and sometimes some of the pieces are just going to be human. That's normal. And so rather than automating everything, we're like, make it easier to automate the stuff you can, but also make it more interoperable with the stuff that's going to be human. And so it's a way of taking the socio-technical systems and viewing them as basically not optimally technical. They're optimally kind of complementary, like living systems. And so we're, I think, pretty excited about this as an approach. And actually, Ellie, I think you should take the next slide, because where it's going is a big deal.
Yeah, okay. So we're also interested in how groups can then share sets of knowledge with each other without having to compromise their own local ontologies as well as practices and ways of doing. We're interested in how these automated processes can assist in translating these knowledge sets across COIs. So for instance, BlockScience, RMIT, my university, and Metagov can just say, okay, this knowledge set over here, take these RIDs, and you'll be able to gain the capabilities that we have already developed, hopefully. And we do think that you can use integrations such as agents to assist with coordinating across groups. So they might, for instance, in this example, it might be that the agent that BlockScience has produced can talk with the Metagov one and help us come up with some really boring processes for getting a project completed. Yeah, so those kinds of ways of making working together easier. So I think I just want to come back to why this matters. Why it matters is it enables knowledge networks among organizations. And our hypothesis here is that there's this fundamental shift away from the theory of them. So those who know what that is, so Ronald Coase, Nobel Prize winning economist, asks this question of why can't we just leave everything up to the market? And we don't leave everything up to the market because of transactions costs, because it's costly to take everything out there to coordinate as separate entities, as individuals trading all the time. So we create firms which internalize some of those processes and therefore gain efficiencies within the firm. And the result for society is that we end up with large firms, platforms, etc., having power because they've found ways, and in particularly in this digital world that we work in, of course, they're also doing that with our data, etc. So we are really interested in the extent to which if we can create knowledge networks, smaller permissionless networks of organizations, like-minded interests such as this incredible regen community we're here with today, can begin to actually gain the scale that they need to be able to create real change in the world. So I'm going to just say, I call this re-demification, to come back to the start. So there's actually Jason Potts here, who's one of our collaborators on the academic part of this research, wrote a piece, and he cites Stephen Wolfram, who says that LLMs are actually just embeddings of embeddings. Because language itself is an embedding of our culture, right? And it's taking mathematical processes to that existing embedding. And as I said at the start, culture makes groups, groups make knowledge, right? What we're trying to do here is, rather than this de-demification, which is occurring with these large language models who are taking all of our knowledge, we're re-demifying it by adding groups and governance and processes and shared practices back into how we use these automated technologies.
So the last commentary is going to be to argue that we are in fact building the technology to do that. So the original long post that talked about these organizations structured this way was actually about how they would communicate with each other, assuming they have independent kind of groupishnesses, personalities at the Deme level, and so realizing that we could construct these things in a way that they may actually want to talk and learn from each other, be social. And so we didn't only hypothesize this, we've also included in our technical requirements for those COI nets the capabilities. So I talked about RIDs being very flexible and able to talk about things, or even talking about things, so like recognizing the representationness of the things being discussed to open up the field of discussion. But also the CoinNets protocol has a architecture where if you make a subnet, so you build a variety of little services or wire together things that you're using within your community, you can also use a coordinator to kind of roughly keep track of what's there, and then a proxy type node that's job is to create effectively an access controlled or gated, almost executive function for that group that would then interact with other proxy nodes from other orgs. And what that means is that the subnet can behave like a node in a higher order network. And that recursion, that zooming, is the thing you actually need to scale without homogenization. And so what we need here is the way that we can build up small groups and medium-sized groups and have them be partially overlapping and networked, and that our underlying information technologies are fighting against that. And so the reason why there's deep technical research, in addition to this like very important social, experimental, and observational work, is that we have to get those things to feed back on each other. Is the tech doing what we want? Is it helping people do what they need to do? Do we have the tech that we want? Is it helping people do what they need to do? And so this has been actually, I think, one of the most important things about Metagov is that it's actually a space where Ellie and I could do this together, given that I run a private firm and live in the US, and she's a full professor and lives in Australia. And so like the very fact that we have an organizational container with space for us to co-PI a project is actually pretty cool in its own right, and I think is one of the reasons why Metagov is an awesome org. And I want to give a thank you to all of you and a shout out to Metagov for being the host of this research project.
Yeah, everybody's